era. Edward would also come to experience this incipient nationalism directly when he became king after his return from the Crusade, King of England. His reign is especially known for his attempts to solidify the ancient claims to Wales and Scotland. With Wales, he succeeded and proceeded to build several castles in Wales to establish the English presence. These castles came with colonies of Englishmen. But Scotland fought back hard, and led by William Wallace and Robert de Bruce, won its independence, at least for now. Of course, all this war also cost money, which is our main point, the next step towards the British constitutional monarchy that is part of the Plantagenet legacy. Basically, since these wars cost money, Edward he needed new revenue. But King Edward went beyond the stipulations of the Magna Carta. In 1295 AD, he demanded that not only would his new taxes be approved by the Great Council, but he wanted 2 knights from every county, 2 burgesses from every borough, and 2 citizens from every city to join the Council of Barons and Bishops, and the king even asked them for their consent. They were not merely advisory, he asked them for their consent in raising new taxes. Edward wanted to make sure that he had the backing of the common people when he made further demands of them. This meeting is known as the Model Parliament because it provided the idea for England's bicameral consultative and later legislative body consisting of a House of Lords and a House of Commons. The Plantagenet House indeed was defining the future England in more ways than one. Soon the incipient nationalism that we saw in Scotland would also take hold of England as well, and the main catalyst of this would be the 100 Years' War, which would begin during the reign of Edward Longshank's grandson, Edward III. Here he is right here. The stage was set by the death of the last Capetian king of France, Charles IV, in 1328 AD. He's dead. Now, after he died, there were 2 good claimants to the throne of France. Let's take a look at the family tree here. One was Count Philip of Valois. Here he is right here. That's because he's King Philip IV the Fair's brother's son. The other was King Edward III of England himself. But here's the problem. The French nobles did not choose Edward III, partly because his claim is traced through a woman, Isabella the She-Wolf of France. She, by the way, is the queen that shows up in the movie Braveheart. And the problem is, the French interpretation of Salic law normally forbid tracing lineage through a woman. And you can see that's the case with Edward III. Of course, the other problem is very simple. Edward III is the King of England, and no King of France wants the King of England to be the King of France. For now, Edward was courteous about this. He actually went ahead and paid homage to the King of France, the new king, Philip VI Valois, for his fief of Gascony. Recall, the English have some land in France, this little piece of Gascony down here, but they hold it as a fief from the French king. But the French would push too far. First of all, they gave asylum to Robert the Bruce, and they also promised Robert the Bruce that if war would begin again between between England and Scotland, the French would help the Scottish. Secondly, Philip VI had tried to organize a crusade, but he then canceled it in 1337. But instead of getting rid of his ships, the ships moved from Marseille in the southern France to the English Channel, and these ships included both Scottish ships and French ships. In response, Edward saw a threat, and he prepared. He sent soldiers up to the border with Scotland, and he sent soldiers prepared to go defend Gascony if need be. So they got them ready on the Cornish coast to go to Gascony if need be. Now, Philip responded by going ahead and taking over Gascony. He basically occupied Gascony for Edward's insubordination. Then Edward threw down the glove. He declared war on what he called the so-called King of France. He shows that he's bitter about the fact that he's not King of France, and he declares war on this so-called king. The long war for the French throne had begun, the 100 Years' War. Now, the 100 Years' War is, of course, very long, but we can summarize the main points in 2 basic ideas. First one is that the English were the dominant for the first 3 quarters of the war, winning smashing victories over far larger French armies at Sluis in 1340, which was a sea battle, at Crécy in 1346, one of their best, and at Poitiers in 1356, which had the most repercussions because in it they actually captured the French king, John II, and held him for ransom. This was a huge blow to the French morale. The English also gained large tracts of land, even Paris and Reims. Reims is important because it's actually the site where French kings are supposed to be crowned. It was a war in which chivalry and knighthood died. While the French relied on knights and tried to abide by a code in which knights fought honorably against knights, the English had no choice but to rely on a largely peasant army armed with the formidable new weapon, the longbow, which could do a lot more damage than the crossbow. It's a lot faster, and its length and its springiness made the arrows go a lot stronger. They could do damage from afar. The English also generally avoided open war and went on slash and burn chevauchés, destroy. And these chevauchés were terrible for the French economy, and they were especially used by King Edward's son, Edward the Black Prince. There he is right there, famous picture of Edward the Black Prince, and here's another picture of Edward III himself commissioning his son to go do these chevauchés. During the war, the House of Plantagenet also came to an end. This is because Edward the Black Prince predeceased his father from an unknown illness. Thus, when Edward III died, his 10-year-old grandson took over as King Richard II. At the same time, there was a ceasefire in France, which ended up not being very good for the English. They were restless. The combination of military restlessness and the youth of the king did not endear Richard II to his people. He also just had a pretty rough reign. For one thing, he had to deal with the Peasants Revolt led by John Ball and Wat Tyler, which was among the worst peasants' revolts in the wake of the Black Death. As you can see, it's one of the most violent, as you can see in this video right here.
Summer of 1381, the peasants left an indelible mark on the history of England. The Peasants' Revolt took everyone by surprise. It was quite astonishing. From out of nowhere, it seemed, tens of thousands of peasants arrived in Blackheath on the outskirts of London and demanded the king abolish all forms of servitude, taxation, and the aristocracy. The king, who was only 14 at the time, quite understandably said he'd need to think it over. The peasants, however, wanted liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And when did they want it? Now. 400 years before the French Revolution. Talk about pushing. The king, who'd been talking to the rebels from this safety barge in the middle of the river, decided to go home for his tea. The peasants obviously needed to make their point more forcibly, so they rampaged through London, killing lots of Flemish people. Not quite sure how that helped. One group broke into the Tower of London. They burst into the royal living quarters, and there, according to the tabloids of the time, they sat on the beds and poked into everything with their filthy sticks. Some of them even tried to kiss the king's mother. They then dragged the Archbishop of Canterbury and the treasurer out of the White Tower and cut off their heads, which they paraded round the town stuck on poles. Now, if it sounds to you like the lunatics have taken over the asylum, that's what a lot of people at the time thought. But they weren't lunatics. The peasants' agenda was informed, tactical, and most of all, political. They targeted lawyers and court officials. They made bonfires of legal and tax records. They were deliberately erasing their servile past. The final straw was when the barons imposed a poll tax to pay for their war in France. This was bitterly resented because it meant that everybody had to pay the same, rich or poor. And to make matters worse, the government got its sums wrong. They based their calculations on the population size before the Black Death. So when they failed to raise the amount they expected, they imposed a second poll tax. And that was when the unthinkable happened. The peasants took up arms and revolted. The climax of the Peasants' Revolt must rank as one of the most extraordinary scenes in history. Tens of thousands of rebelling peasants confronted the country's aristocracy, led by the king, a 14-year-old boy. The peasants' leader, Wat Tyler, rode towards the boy king to make his demands, and then took a swig from a jug of ale, whereupon the mayor of London charged and cut him down. It looked as if the huge throng were about to attack the aristocracy, but the king suddenly rode forward and shouted, "I'll be your leader, follow me!" The king granted the peasants pardons and promised to abolish serfdom. But once the rebels had dispersed, the barons quickly set about slaughtering the ringleaders. Thousands of peasants died.
So you see that King Richard II actually dealt with the Peasants' Revolt quite decisively, but he also has been having a rough reign, and there's a lot of people who don't like him. It was also Richard, the last Plantagenet, who brought to fruition a dream of Henry II, the First Plantagenet, by passing the Statute of Praemunire in 1393. This statute and its related statutes basically made an outlaw of any Englishman who aided a foreign power, especially the papacy, to the detriment of Englishmen. Popes had been used to treating England as their own territory since Innocent III, but with these statutes, no money could go to the Pope, either one, that is, for this was the time of the Great Schism and there were two popes, without the king's leave. No appeals could be made to the Pope against an Englishman. No non-Englishman could hold an ecclesiastical role with a benefice in England, and all benefices reverted to the king. It was all only a matter of English law. That is, it didn't really bind the popes, and the popes were quite angry about it, but they could do little to stop it. They were too busy dealing with rival papacies and renegade councils to intervene as Innocent III had done, and furthermore, the people of England are more afraid of their king who stands by, or who is close by, than they are of the Pope who's far away. Thus, Henry VIII, in his own time, would already have a body of precedent, a body of case law, that he could draw upon when he wanted to close England off completely from the papacy and the Catholic Church. Now, despite his decisive treatment of the peasants and his reversal of the situation with the church as King John had left it, Richard was not popular. He often gave the nobility short shrift, in particular his cousin Henry Bolingbroke. Henry Bolingbroke also was a guy who supported the rights of the church, contrary to King Richard. Thus, in 1399, Henry gathered the support of both the barons and the bishops, this is him right here, and he's talking to the bishops and the barons, and had himself declared king in place of Richard in 1399. As you can see it right here. Here's Richard handing over his crown to Henry Bolingbroke. No one quite knows if this actually happened, if Richard handed it over willingly or not. And thus began the English House of Lancaster. Richard himself was imprisoned in the Tower of London, built by William the Conqueror, and died the next year under mysterious circumstances. Henry IV Bolingbroke had to spend the rest of his reign confirming his newly gotten throne, suppressing rebellions by nobles, Welsh, and Scots. But by the time of his death in 1413, the House of Lancaster was firmly established. His son Henry V took over, another one of England's most beloved kings. Henry had one goal, the throne of France. He renewed the 100 Years' War, and he went on a recruitment campaign to gain support for the war against the French. This begins the strongly nationalist phase of the 100 Years' War. The royal house spoke about fighting for England. They appealed to the legends of King Arthur, a thing that had already been done since the time of Edward Longshanks. Even priests preached from the pulpit that God was English. It was a nationalism indeed, but definitely there's a big difference between it and the nationalism of the 19th century. It's a nationalism, this 100 Years' War nationalism, is still centered on the person of the monarch. Henry led the English to another smashing victory at Agincourt in 1415. And here's an actual contemporary picture of Agincourt right here. The terms of the Treaty of Troyes that came afterward in 1420 seemed to mean the end of the war. Henry married the French princess Catherine, as you can see right here. Here's Catherine, here's Henry. And it was agreed that he would become King of France after the death of her father, Charles VI. All seemed over for France. But as it turns out, God is not English. The same year that Charles VI of France died, Henry V also died. Furthermore, his son Henry VI, just give me a second here. His son Henry VI was young and prone to bouts of insanity. Finally, the Dauphin, the Prince of France, his also name was Charles, here he is right here, had no intentions of relinquishing the rest of France. Unfortunately, he could not be crowned unless he made it to Rheims. So he's a prince without a crown. He could not be crowned unless he made it to Rheims. But the English and the French forces had been at a standstill at Orleans, defended by the English. And Charles had no plan. The French were totally demoralized and just could not break the siege at Orleans. The solution came from an unlikely source. A 17-year-old girl, right at this time, named Joan of Arc, came to the Dauphin and convinced him that God had commanded her to raise the siege of Orleans and get the Dauphin crowned at Rheims. Charles entrusted to her the entire armed forces of France, unmatched in history for any 17-year-old, and she succeeded in precisely those tasks, raising the siege of Orleans and getting the king crowned at Rheims in short time. She fought for the heavenly king and for France, and it was the shot in the arm that the French morale needed. A new weapon also made its entrance during the 100 Years' War in this last phase, the cannon. At Agincourt, the first man ever to be killed by an arquebus died. Here's an arquebus right here. It's a predecessor of the musket and a descendant of the hand cannon. This is a hand cannon right here that was already used in the 14th century. And at the siege of Orleans, the French used cannons against the fortifications. It would be an exaggeration to say that the 100 Years' War was the beginning of early modern warfare, but there is no doubt that it was not medieval warfare. It was certainly a war of transition in so many ways. At any rate, the French won the war in 1453, and with the exception of Calais, the English lost all their lands in France. You can see the huge change. All this belongs to France, and then the English have England and just Calais, the port of Calais up there.